Good evening. Welcome to week 3 for Intel for counter political violence and terrorism. Again, just do a short lecture today. But first, I want to hit up on your papers. Uh, Read a few of them, read most of them, marked a few of them, and I'll say that they were good. Most of them were written okay, but uh, I want to get to your analysis for the papers. And that's going to be especially true from here on in. I don't want 3 pages of background and a page or two of analysis. I want you to kind of get to your analysis right from the onset. And I know for this week there was history. We wanted some history put in there, but if you're going to start your paper off, at the 10th century AD, you've pretty much lost your reader right there. And you can imagine these papers, it's like a policy paper. You want to write it so that the person who's reading it doesn't have a lot of time, and he could send that paper up the chain of command. And that's kind of the essence of what you're trying to do. So trying to communicate something in a very short, concise message. Please use headings and subheadings in your paper. Do not just put in like 6 pages. So that put in like headings and then subheadings and down the line so I can follow it a little bit easier. That adds to clarity. And make sure you put footnotes as well. Some of you put internal citations. I should have mentioned that earlier, but just make sure to do footnotes from here on in. So again, for the papers from here on in, I want your analysis. That's going to be a more critical point than just regurgitating history or something like that. So just want to make that clear from here on in. So just want to call off Terroist Adaptation, and the RAND paper does this pretty well at a micro level, but I want to actually look at something a little bit more macro level. How does a terrorist adapt? Why do certain terrorist organizations thrive and become political entities? Hezbollah, and a lot of you are doing your papers on that. Hezbollah is one, which was a terrorist organization, killed a lot of people, but now is a big political player in Lebanon. And why do other terrorist organizations dissipate? Al-Qaeda is one. Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, the armed Islamic group, Sikh separatism. These are terrorists that have been subjected to the ash bin of history, for lack of better words. So we have to ask our questions: why some succeed, why fail? And I know that in the reading there was a lot of cycles or how terrorists adapt. I want to kind of put with this macro level cycle here. What we have kind of is the initial fissure, and this kind of goes in order. And this is why the terrorist group takes over to start. The initial fissure. It's why the IRA, Irish and the British didn't get along, and that's why you had, IRA terrorism. You had in Algeria, some of you are doing Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. The origins go back to Algeria, where the Islamic government was pushed out after elections, and that was the initial fissure. For Iraq, you had the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So you had the initial fissure, and that led to terrorist activity. And if the organization's successful, and most of the ones you're doing research papers on, this terrorist activity becomes known. It becomes widespread. It coheses the group. People want to join the group because they're the biggest badasses on the street, so to speak. It's excellent for recruitment, and it shows that the government is weak. And that's probably the heyday of terrorist activity. But what you have in almost all terrorist organization is that split in the terrorist group, and it's usually between the moderates and the radicals. And in a lot of cases, the radicals, the terrorist organization gets pushed to the right, and the radicals take over. These are the people that can't forge a political philosophy, who can't tie objectives to what you're doing to some sort of strategic goal. They're in it eventually just to kill people. And as the terrorist group evolves, you see these two fissures tend to break up. So you had the people who were angry at a political objective, or angry for political reasons, and then they turn to the hardened terrorists, or the more extreme ones, and they coalesce for a while, and then they split up. And the Iraq insurgency PBS frontline was an excellent example of that. And you saw that where the nationalists were being co-opted by the jihadists, and then later on, after that video, there was a split between the nationalists and the jihadists. So when that split occurs, the hardened wing of the terrorist organization tends to become even more radical. And this is where the terrorist organization usually takes their steps towards extinction. I have kind of 3 examples here. This occurred in the 90s, and I apologize if it's graphic, but this is during the GIA, the Armed Islamic Group in Algeria. And I chose this because a lot of you are doing AQIM. And what happens was the hard extremist organization, the hardened part, split off, and to prove their badassery, for lack of a better term, they decided to do massacres of civilians. And this is just one example. You saw hundreds of massacres of civilians in Algeria, all in the mid to late 90s, and it really, really led to the Armed Islamic Group to be extinct. And that's what happened. The harder wings just became a lot more extreme, a lot more extreme, a lot more extreme, and eventually it dissipated from the civilian population. One of the great ironies in the Algerian case is Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, the predecessor organization, GSPC, split from the GIA because the GIA was engaging in too much of a extremist case, too much violence against civilians. So it's ironic, Al-Qaeda stopped swearing allegiance or stopped being part of the Armed Islamic Group because it was too violent. And that's how the GSPC and later Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb was formed, because ironically, they were the more moderate element. What you see here, a lot of you probably don't remember this. This was the Sikh bombing of Air India Flight 182. And this was part of that hardening of the terrorist organization, where you had the Sikh separatists. This was a religious minority in India, had legitimate political gains, political grievances. They engaged in terrorist activity, but the hard extreme wing bombed a Air India flight flying over the Atlantic, and this really, really painted the Sikh separatist movements as a bunch of violent thugs, and the violent wing of the group eventually forced the terrorist organization to become extinct. So that's 2. And then this guy here, some of you might have worked with them personally. This is Sons of Iraq. This is a part of that Iraq splinter groups, or the splinter groups we co-opted. That's another example where the terrorist organization became so hardened that their more moderate wings were able to be co-opted by the counter-terrorist organization. And the PBS frontline kind of alludes to a lot of that. And when you have that, and then you have the counterterrorism organization try and split the terrorist organization as much as possible. The Algerians had an excellent amnesty program, brought a lot of the GIA people back into the fold. The Americans, again, in Iraq, had the Sons of Iraq, which was essentially an amnesty program. And that brought a lot of the wind out of the insurgency. And that eventually leads to the extinction of the group. So when we're looking as an analyst, you're looking at a terrorist organization, this is kind of what we're trying to there's patterns that we're trying to see. And if you're an intel analyst especially, what you're trying to do is find some of those splits in the terrorist group. So I just want to cover Iraq insurgency before I sign off here. What were the causes of the Iraq insurgency? I think anyone's been to Iraq is pretty clear. The video hits this on the head. The disbanding of the Iraqi army combined with the lack of jobs and the occupying force of the Americans added fuel to the insurgency. That shouldn't be, whether you agree with Iraq or not, that's what were the drivers of the insurgency. The chaos we talked about earlier, that was a huge driver of the insurgency. The looting and other issues, other mistakes that were made in the fall gave a lot of wind to the Iraq insurgency. But more importantly, you see the insurgency in the group becoming more Islamicized, and Michael Ware in the movie says that. And that's kind of one of those odd adaptations that you had a very secular insurgency suddenly paying allegiance to Zarqawi. And that was probably the more surprising part of how this insurgency metastasized. But then you see, again, the Iraq insurgency. It's not in the movie because the movie happened before it, but then you see it becomes so hardened that the insurgency splits. And that results in finally the decline of al-Qaeda in Iraq, although it's still around. So I just want to cover the Iraq insurgency piece, and I look forward to your thoughts, again, on the discussion board. And if there's any issues or problems, let me know. I should have the papers graded by the end of the week, and the tests and participation shortly thereafter.